This video relates to socialism key thinker number 4, Anthony Crosland. I'll talk a little bit about his background before his views on human nature, state, society and economy. Anthony Crosland is born in 1918. He served in the armed forces in the Second World War and then returned to England to take a first-class PPE degree from Oxford. When he is essentially headhunted into Labour Party politics, he is a member of the Fabian Society, but very different to the thinking of Beatrice Webb. In fact, he wanted to move the Fabian Society away from the dominance of the thinking of Beatrice Webb and her husband Sidney. He was considered on the right wing of the Labour Party for his time, but you would very much, in a modern context, refer to him as an old Labour politician. And that's because in his book, Future of Socialism, written in 1956, he argues against collective ownership. What we're moving away from now with our next two key thinkers is socialism isn't an end goal, it isn't a concept, it's a set of values. So for Crosland, the world had moved on. Socialism needed to adapt and modernise. And so to argue simply for collective ownership for the sake of it wasn't the right thing to do. Instead, his priority was to improve public services and end poverty through a well-funded welfare state. And so what we start to see figures like Crosland on the right wing of the Labour Party do is advocate for a mixed economy, where the government can, in its best attempt, manage the economy. So Beatrice Webb believed that capitalism was volatile, and Crosland would agree with that. But Crosland would say that the economy needed to be managed rather than entirely controlled by the state. The key policy that Crosland is known for is the promotion of the comprehensive secondary school system when he was Education Secretary. The grammar school system and the 11 plus exam was set up with the intention of giving students the ability to go to grammar schools based on their 11 plus results. But what resulted was a class divide, and very few students from working class backgrounds made their way into the grammar school system. And Crosland saw the grammar school system as a way in which social divides were being upheld, and campaigned against it and introduced a comprehensive system in which individuals went to the same comprehensive secondary school based on their geography, based on where they lived, not necessarily whether they could pass the 11 plus. So the key thing that you need to remember for Crosland and later for key thinker number 5 is that by this point, socialism to these key thinkers is a set of values rather than a destination. So let's start with human nature. For Anthony Crosland, he believed that we all had an innate sense of fairness and an objection to huge inequalities of outcome. So for Crosland, he believed that it was natural and right for most citizens to want to end the grammar school system. As I said, it became a symbol of social inequality. In theory, it was a vehicle for social mobility, the idea being that every student up and down the country sat the 11 plus exam upon leaving primary school, and depending on their results in that exam, depended on the secondary school that they would go to. The idea being that regardless of your background, it would be your intellectual ability that would decide whether or not you go to a grammar school or not. However, in reality, what happened was that students who lived in more affluent areas, who went to better primary schools, who were able to afford tutors, who were able to be prepared and tested for that 11 plus exam, were more likely to get into the grammar schools. And so what was supposed to be a vehicle for social mobility actually upheld social differences. So Crosland, as Education Secretary, led a campaign to replace the grammar school system with a comprehensive school system. And he was passionate about doing so. And that's because he believed that human beings had this innate sense of fairness and right and wrong. And because it was wrong to uphold social injustice, then he had a duty to remove that grammar school system. And he expected that most people in society would be in agreement with him. Next, we'll jump across to the state. What we have now with key thinker number 4, Anthony Crosland, is the first of our key thinkers that doesn't think that capitalism needs to go, that needs to be replaced. What Crosland believes is that we can manage and temper capitalism so that it works better for as many people as possible. And so a democratic socialist government, in this case, the Labour Party governments of the post-war era, that is the best way to bring about the values of socialism. The existing state structure can be used to bring about meaningful, radical socialist change. And so for Crosland, the end goal was not to replace the state. Actually, the values of socialism for him could be enacted, could be brought about within the existing capitalist state. And we'll move on to the economy, and we'll talk about Keynesian economics in just a moment. But before we do, the key thing that I need you to remember when it comes to the state is that, yes, the state is not perfect and it needs to be reformed, but that does not necessarily mean that there needs to be the overthrow of capitalism, gradual or otherwise. All of our key thinkers to date, key thinkers 1, 2 and 3, have all argued in one way or another that capitalism needs to go. Crosland does not buy into that argument. He thinks that capitalism needs to get better, capitalism needs to be, or the capitalist state needs to be reformed, but change, meaningful change, can happen without overthrowing the capitalist state. We'll talk about society next before finishing on the economy. For Crosland, society has become more complicated. So Marx had a very clear distinction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which Crosland rejected. For Crosland, the world that he lived in, certainly after the Second World War, society was far more complex than Marx had identified. There wasn't simply a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. New jobs and new industries had arisen, which meant that social classes had changed and the boundaries between social classes had blurred. That's not to say that the largest group in society wasn't the working class, but what we see is, particularly in industries like technology, young industries that were emerging after the Second World War, these industries didn't necessarily have a social class. They weren't based and set in old traditions and the way things had been, and depending on the school or the university that you went to. What we start to see with technology is it's much more of a democratic industry, and it's easier for people to get into with the right training. And so those boundaries of social class had to change. And although there was the well-off and the less well-off, there still was the haves and the have-nots. But for Crosland, it just wasn't as simple as bourgeoisie and proletariat. Society had changed and modernised, and so did socialism needed to follow suit. Okay, finally, the economy. So Crosland does not reject public ownership. Crosland supports public ownership, but not of the entire economy. So all three key thinkers to date have argued that capitalism needs to be replaced with common ownership. That is not something that Crosland wants to see happen. He believes that a mixed economy of some privately controlled industries mixed with some public-owned industries can work to bring about the values of socialism. Because what you saw with the Labour Party when it came into government in 1945 is there was some nationalisation of industry, but not on a grand scale. And remember that Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution had said that the common ownership of the means of production was key to the Labour Party. But even that government of 1945 to 51 hadn't begun nationalisation on a full scale. It was on a grand scale. It was radical. It was nationalisation, the likes of which the country had never seen. But it wasn't across the whole economy. And Crosland was committed to maintaining that mixed economy. And it's what we call a Keynesian economy. Now, students of economics will know John Maynard Keynes far better than someone who doesn't study economics. And actually, an economics student will probably know Keynesian economics better than I do. But essentially what Keynesianism is that the economy can be managed. So there are certain industries that may be state-owned, certain industries that are not. Usually it's the more volatile industries that should be brought under state ownership. The idea being is that when these industries run at a cost to the people, when these industries are making a loss, it's the state that foots the bill. But also when that industry performs well, it's money back into the British economy. And what Crosland and what people who buy into Keynesian economics attempt to do is manage the economy to make it work for as many people as possible rather than control it in its entirety. So what we're starting to see is a cooling off of views towards capitalism. Remember that for Marx and Engels, capitalism was responsible for all the ills of society, and the world was going to be and would inevitably be a better place when capitalism was gone. Even Webb, key thinker number 3, was arguing for the eventual replacement of capitalism. But what we're starting to see now is this view that capitalism could be limited and be made kinder. And the idea of that, a kinder face of capitalism, is that it will increase public spending, which will be invested into areas of society that need it most, and which will reduce inequality.